Welcome, everyone. Today we're going to be discussing a very important topic that you probably haven't seen much information about in the mainstream media. Right now, there are huge protests in Iraq going on. This is of major significance. There hasn't been much coverage of the situation in Iraq, especially in the mainstream Western media. Ever since the 2003 U.S. invasion, the country has been in a terrible situation. The only time you really hear about it in the news is about terrorism, stuff related to Iran and the United States competing with one another. But you don't hear much about what's going on with the Iraqi people themselves and the struggle of the Iraqi people against the corrupt regime and the terrible exploitation of the country that's been going on. So today, we're going to be going over the major protests that have been going on in Iraq and the history of them, what led up to this point, and really giving you an understanding of what's going on. And we have a guest today who's going to give a perspective that you're not going to see very easily. It's going to be hard to come by in the West. His name is Falastini Mukhtarab, and he's a Palestinian-American professor in the Arab world who has been following Iraq for a very long time. He's been a staunch anti-imperialist, anti-Zionist activist who has been very strongly organizing against imperialism, not only in the Arab world, but internationally as well, but with a particular focus on the situation of Iraq. Welcome. Please introduce yourself to the audience.
Hi, Nick. Thank you for hosting me. I'm very excited about this opportunity to be a guest on the Flame of Liberation. I want to congratulate you on being one of the very few people that I know over the last 10 or 15 years of organizing in the U.S. to have someone dedicated as yourself, not only for the cause of Iraq and Palestine, but also as a staunch anti-imperialist yourself and an anti-Zionist. And it's particularly impressive for me to be an anti-Zionist, anti-imperialist leftist in America today, because there aren't very many who take on such strong positions. I think it's a great opportunity for us to finally meet. I know we've been following each other for the last 5 or more years over social media. Um, Introducing myself, I'm a college professor. I'm Palestinian American. I'm working currently outside of the US in Arabia. I am not in Iraq, I'm outside of Iraq, but I have been writing about Iraq and following what's going on in Iraq for at least 10 years. And I publish a weekly report on Iraq on Facebook as part of the US Committee for Iraq that is run by a group of activists, which Nick is part of. Um, and I've been doing it, I can't even remember when I started doing this. I'm going to say at least 10 years, as far as I can remember. And it's given me the opportunity to follow what's going on in Iraq closely. I also have many connections with Iraqis who are either academics or in political leadership positions or are activists themselves inside of Iraq and outside of Iraq. And I follow what they write and post as to keep in touch with what's going on right now. On October 1st, this last Saturday, protests began in Baghdad and all over Iraq, in fact, particularly the southern provinces, to mark and commemorate the third year anniversary that began with the protests, anti-government protests that began in 2019. So we're here today to talk about these protests, a little bit of historical background to what led to the 2019 protests, and then to give you a brief update on what is going on right now, what is the status of the protests, and then finally, what are the goals that the protesters are trying to achieve, what are basically their demands.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for those kind words. And yeah, it's true. We've been interacting a lot over the years on social media, and it's really amazing your dedication to Iraq and the whole struggle of anti-imperialism and liberation. Because for years and years, ever since I've known you, and probably well before I knew you, every single week you post an update on the situation in Iraq. Every single week consistently. I remember seeing that for years, and you cover information that you're not going to find, that people are not going to find in the Western press. It's very important information about the truth of the situation in Iraq. So I really want to commend you for that, and it's really great to finally have you on the program.
Thank you. Iraq is extremely important, Nick, from an anti-imperialist point of view and also from an anti-Zionist point of view, because Iraq used to be, under the Ba'athist government, the base from which the whole Arab revolution against imperialism was launching. And by destroying Iraq, they took away, by they, the imperialists and the Zionists, took away one of the most important bases for revolutionary work in Arabia. And so we lost a very, very important launching pad, if you want, of the anti-imperialist struggle. And anybody who's is sincere and earnest about fighting imperialism in Arabia has to be involved in the Iraqi war for independence. And as you know, when we say independence, we mean to get rid of the current government that has been instilled by the American imperialists with the help of the Iranian regime.
Absolutely. And to further make the point even stronger, I mean, you yourself, you're Palestinian. I tell people this all the time. Palestinians know very well what Iraq represented as a stronghold, as a vanguard of anti-imperialism, anti-Zionism, fighting for the liberation of Palestine, the Arab world, and indeed, if you look at the Ba'athist ideology, indeed the liberation of humanity as a whole, but obviously especially the Arab world, and Palestine being the key question to that. So you mentioned how imperialists, they targeted Iraq. There's a reason why they targeted Iraq with such viciousness and so early on. It was because it was such a staunch vanguard of anti-imperialism and liberation and socialism. And that's why they targeted it and focused so much on trying to destroy the country, and worked with so many different forces. As you mentioned, Iran. To a lot of people in the West, this may seem surprising to them, but absolutely, the United States and Iran worked very closely, especially following the 2003 invasion, to destabilize and destroy the country of Iraq. But despite all of this, as we're seeing right now with these protests in Iraq, the Iraqi people cannot be destroyed. The Iraqi people cannot be held back, and they will continue to fight for their freedom. And many of these protesters have shown sympathy for what life was like before 2003, the Ba'athist socialist government, because of how prosperous Iraq was at the time period. So despite all the destruction and everything that the imperialists and their allies have done to Iraq, we see the Iraqi people still standing up today. And when we look at it, so there's the protests going on today. Could you give like a very brief overview of what's going on with the protests today? What exactly, what are like some of the key points people should understand? Then later we'll go into more in depth about it.
Well, as you know, Nick, it's important the point you bring up about Iran, because anybody, and I've been a political organizer in the U.S. for many, many years, for the last 20 years. And before I came to Arabia, I was organizing anti-imperialist, anti-Zionist activities in the United States. And during that time, one of the hardest things that we have had to face, and especially with Iraq, is to convince the left, the American left, that Iran is the regime in Iran. I'm not talking about the people of Iran. I'm talking about the regime in Iran is a reactionary regime. It is not truly anti-Zionist, and it's not truly anti-imperialist as it professes, as the propaganda that it puts out says it is. And if you want proof of this, and I'm addressing American leftists since this is a leftist media outlet, if you are a communist, if you're an American communist, or if you are an American leftist, or if you are a European leftist, if you're a Western leftist, you have to understand that these protests in Iraq are anti-Iranian. They are not pro-Iran, okay? And so if you don't believe me, you listen to what the protesters in Baghdad have been saying since 2019. Iran, get out of Iraq. Iran is an occupying force in Iraq. It's just as evil as the American occupation of Iraq. So the demands of the protesters, to answer your question, are Iran out of Iraq, America out of Iraq. Both are occupying forces in Iraq. And in fact, the Iranians have done, I'm going to say, worst destruction of Iraq than the Americans did, for the simple reason that they have increased sectarian violence in the country. They have pitted Shia against Sunni and Sunnis against Shia. They play the sectarian card. The reason why we call Iran a reactionary regime is because it is a sectarian regime. It wants to build a Shia state with the Wali al-Faqih, whether it be Ayatollah Khomeini in the past or Ali Khamenei of current. They want to build an empire where these figureheads run that empire based on Shia sectarianism. And Iraq is a secular state, has always been a secular state. Under the Ba'ath and before the Ba'ath, we did not have sectarian violence as we do today. The reason why there's sectarian violence in Iraq today is because of the Iranian role in Iraqi politics. And before that, the Americans, while they were occupying Iraq, played the sectarian card just as much as the Iranians are playing the sectarian card today. They empowered Sunnis against Shias, then they empowered Kurds against the Shias and the Sunnis, then they empowered the Shias against the Sunnis and the Kurds. It is a staple of their policy that they inherited from British imperialism, which is built on split, divide, weaken, and conquer. That is their strategy. It's been like that since the British colonial times. It is like that with the American imperialist era, and it is definitely playing out in Iranian strategic plans for Iraq to build a Shia state where the center of power is in Tehran or Qom or any of the other places that they consider holy. And the price to be paid is this inner killing and destruction of the Iraqi people. And so if you listen in to the demands of the Iraqi protesters today, you can clearly see that they are well conscious of this. They understand this very well. Many of them, as we spoke earlier, me and you, Nick, are in their 20s. So these aren't people, or these aren't youth that grew up under Saddam. They didn't even know Saddam, even though their parents may have lived under Saddam and the Ba'athist state. These young activists that are now putting their lives on the line to get Iran out, to get their country back, to have sovereignty, to have self-determination, to have a voice and a say in what happens in their country, to regain their freedom and liberate their nation. They're all anti-Iranian.
Absolutely, and something that people need to understand, especially people who consider themselves to be anti-imperialists in the West, is that in Iraq, to be anti-Iran does not mean that you are pro-US. And as you explained, these protesters are against any foreign occupation of the country, any foreign meddling, any foreign exploitation of the country, and they're staunchly against the US influence in Iraq, and they're staunchly against the Iranian influence in Iraq. And so this is a huge development, and this is again demonstrates that, you know, despite 2003, despite all the destruction that has been brought against Iraq, the Iraqi people have not been subdued. They're still fighting for their country and for liberation. But if you could go into a little bit of the history of the protests, because this actually isn't like a particularly new thing. This is very significant what's going on now. It's a continuation, but sort of what's going on now sort of started in 2019. Could you talk a little bit about the protests of 2019 and how it sort of led up to today?
Yeah, sure. In 2017, I published a book. It's available on Amazon. It's called U.S. Foreign Policy in Iraq and the Iraqi Resistance. And in it, I highlighted the roots of the Iranian involvement in what led to basically the government that is running Iraq today, the pro-Iran government that is running Iraq today. And one of the things I urge American leftists to look into, you need to go on the internet and you need to look up the Baker-Hamilton document. The Baker-Hamilton document was a co-party document that was drafted by both the Democratic and Republican Party in the United States. Baker, of course, as you know, was the head of state at that time, and Hamilton was from the Democratic Party side. Go look into the Baker-Hamilton agreement. That basically forecasted the Iranians taking over government in Iraq. The American plans were as such that they will withdraw their troops, regular troops from Iraq, and put in place, they're not going to leave Iraq to the Ba'athists, and they're not going to leave Iraq to a patriotic Iraqi government. They wanted the Iranians to fill in that vacuum. This was all planned out. This did not come as a coincidence. The Americans had planned to leave Iraq and give it to Iranian allied politicians. Okay, they gave it to the Iranians, basically, is what they did. So what we see today is rooted deep in U.S. foreign policy, U.S. imperialist foreign policy with regards to Iraq. Look up the Baker-Hamilton Agreement. Now, to talk about the 2019 protests, to cut a long story short, Iraq was invaded in 2003 by the Americans, and quickly President Saddam was handed over to Iranian agents of Iraqi nationality that executed him. They murdered him. And at the same time, he had planned a guerrilla type warfare, arming, you know, hundreds of cells of ex-military personnel in the Iraqi army. He had provided a cache of weapons, money. Izzat Ibrahim al-Duri, who became his successor and the Secretary General of the Ba'ath Party, led the guerrilla warfare against American occupying troops to great success. Almost immediately, bombs, detonated planted devices were target sniper attacks on American occupying forces started taking a big toll on American troops based in Iraq. This did not stop from 2003 up until 2011. For more than 8 years, the Iraqi resistance was carrying out hundreds of military operations against US troops. The US concedes officially of 4,000 deaths, but the figures placed by the Ba'ath Party are in the 100,000. And one of the ways that the Americans have been able to hide their casualties is they don't consider green card holders and immigrant soldiers. You know, many of the poorer working class recruits that serve in the US Army in Iraq came from Nicaragua and Guatemala and other places, and they were promised green cards at the end of their tour of duty. And as a result, when they get killed or they get injured, the US Department does not report them as American casualties. But by the least figures offered by the American government, 4,000 killed, but tens of thousands injured. And those tens of thousands weren't just injured like little injuries, and these are handicapped with amputated limbs. You know, they lost their eyes. Many of them suffer post-war syndrome, and you know, they go back to the US. They're either in poverty, or they go and they beat on their wives, or they kill their wives. They go mental and open fire in a public place. So this has definitely taken a big toll on American regular troops, up until the point when Obama pulled out regular American troops in 2011. And in 2011, you know, they left behind anywhere between 3,000 to 5,000 American troops as advisors to the Iraqi government. The American plan was to bring in Iran to fill in that vacuum. And so from 2011 on, people like Nouri al-Maliki, big criminal in the Iraqi government, committed atrocities against Iraqi people almost immediately. These were ex-Dawa party members. Nouri al-Maliki is a Dawa party member. Dawa party is an Iranian supported, ideologically committed to the Iranian revolution, and was doing subservient or underground operations in Iraq during the Ba'athist time. These aren't exactly, you know, friendly politicians or anything like that.
And just to interject, sorry to interrupt, but this guy and this party, Maliki and the Dawa party, they were traitors against Iraq. They sided with the enemy country. They sided with Iran against their own country during the Iran-Iraq war. Just wanted to throw that in there.
Yes, of course. And they're proud of that. People like Hadi al-Amiri, who became a big figure in the Iraqi government, served in the Iranian army and killed the Iraqi soldiers. And they shot at their own people. Nouri al-Maliki himself has a famous, you can find this on YouTube, it's no secret, where he says, "I'm Shia first and Iraqi second." Okay, and so his allegiance is to Ayatollah Khomeini and the Iranian Revolution, more so than the Iraq, his own country and his own people. And this isn't something he's shy from saying. As I said, you can find a recording of this on the internet. and many others. Most of the people you see, Haidar al-Abbadi, there's like a half a dozen of them that took on leadership positions in the Iraqi government. All these were ex-Dawa party members that used to be exiled. They were in London, England, and other places, and they would be involved in planning assassination attempts, like they tried to kill Tariq Aziz in al-Mustansariya University at one point, threw a grenade at him that missed him and killed some innocent people that were in the area of the university. So they've got a bloody history, and the Iraqi people know this. And so, to speed forward from 2012, Nouri al-Malik, and I wrote about this in the book that's on Amazon. In 2012, Nouri al-Maliki committed the Hawija massacre, where he just, killed peaceful protests, anti-government protests that took place in 2012, a year after the U.S. pulled out American troops. And almost immediately after, there was a armed revolt that took Al-Anbar as its base. So they launched these massive guerrilla attacks, cells of paramilitary, patriotic Iraqis, and the Ba'ath was very much involved in organizing this. There was a conglomerate of resistance parties that came together under the leadership of Izzat al-Duri, and they launched a massive attack. In fact, I remember reporting at that time that they reached Baghdad. This was Al-Anbar, so somewhere in the north, and they drove down all the way to the capital, which is somewhere in the center of Iraq, and almost took Saddam Airport. At that point in time, al-Maliki orchestrated the Mosul incident, where he withdrew government troops deliberately to allow for ISIS to go into Mosul in 2014, sabotaging this massive offensive that was targeting the Iraqi government. And so from 2014 onwards, the city of Mosul was almost demolished with a tremendous loss of life, because what Nouri al-Maliki did is he ordered the recapture of the city with the pro-Iran militia involved, like the Hashd and others. And so they came back, they destroyed the city and drove out ISIS from the city. Anyway, to move on to 2019, the point I'm trying to make here is that there was no point in time that the Iraqi people stopped resisting both the American occupation and the Iranian-led government that was put in place by the Americans and the Iranians to take over for the Americans in Iraq. And so in 2019, what was new was the southern provinces rose in rebellion. The southern provinces are predominantly Shia. And so the Al-Anbar military offensive that the Iraqi resistance led after the Hawija massacre in 2012, those were mostly Sunnis. But for the first time, the Shia population of Iraqis rose against the government. And they rose against the government because this is a completely failed government. It is corrupt. It is made up of thieves. Iraqis don't have drinking water, like in Al-Basra. They don't have electricity. This government, since 2003, has not built a suitable road, bridge, fixed any of the living problems that the Iraqi people suffer day in and day out. And so they just had enough. And they rose in large numbers. They drove into Tahrir Square in 2019. This became known as the October Revolution, which began on October 1st, 2019. And in 2019, of course, the government's reaction to this was brutal. It was criminal. They massacred protesters. I tried to look up some figures from the internet. I found that CNN, I tried to rely on an American outlet. So CNN on November 10th, 2019, reported that the October 1st protest led to 319 protesters killed and 15,000 injured. And when we say injured, these weren't simple injuries. These were people that lost limbs, eyes, and so criminal are the security forces and the pro-Iran militia that support them, is that they literally use gas canisters to target the skulls and the heads of these youth, these kids in their 20s and they're 22, 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds, 22-year-olds. We saw pictures of tear gas canisters embedded in the heads of protesters. There is no limit to how criminal and brutal the response of the government was against its own people that were just demanding that they have a voice in who rules the country, to have a democratically elected government, to have basic living necessities provided by the government, water, electricity, jobs, healthcare, education. There is nothing in Iraq right now. These thieves in government have ran the country bankrupt, although it's one of the richest Arab states with its reserves of oil. They have just stole the money, transferred it out to their bank accounts in Europe and elsewhere, and robbed the country blind. And so that's what took place in 2019. That was the response of the government to the protests in 2019. And speeding forward to 2022, the corona epidemic happened. And so in 2020 and 2021, the demonstrations started to fizzle out because this epidemic was running rapid throughout the country. And obviously there was no health care and no safety precautions for any of the people. And so, but they didn't stop, they continued. And they would commemorate the anniversary of the October 2019 uprising in 2020, 2021, and now in 2022. And the demands are basically still the same. We want a free democratic election. We want a patriotic government that's made up of qualified people, doctors and engineers and specialists. And Iraq has plenty of those. A lot of them have gone away. They've left the country, but there are many still there, and there are many that can come back. And we just want people that can run our country and provide us basic living necessities. And so what had developed, though, what is new now is this inter-Shia fighting that's taking place. And that has thrown off a lot of people, especially the leftists, right? They want to understand this Muqtada Sadr and whether Muqtada Sadr is good, whether he's bad, what is his position towards Iran, what is his position towards the Americans. And if you talk to Iraqis, in fact, the BBC ran a story the morning of Saturday, October 1st. And in it, they interviewed one of the organizers of the Iraqi protest, and they explicitly asked this question. They asked him what he thought about Muqtada Sadr and what is the position of the demonstrations in Iraq on Muqtada Sadr. And he basically said, Muqtada Sadr is a criminal. We are against Muqtada Sadr. We are not for Muqtada Sadr. So why is he a criminal? There's an incident that he was implicated in the last year or so. I think I mentioned it to you, Nick. It has the name Jarratul Udhn in Arabic, and what it means is a prick of an ear. What he did was, in a show of force, he went out and he massacred about a dozen protesters, anti-government protesters. in either Najaf or Karbala, I can't remember now. If you ask Iraqis, they'll tell you about it. And the interview by the BBC on this last Saturday, the activist that spoke out, the organizers of the protests, one of the leaders of the organized protests, mentioned this incident. He said, if you want proof that Muqtada Sadr is not clean, you need to go back to Jarratul Udhur and what he did when he killed protesters in a show of force. What's happening right now with Muqtada Sadr? It's a fight between the thieves, right? It's one thief he's a landlord, a warlord. Muqtada Sadr is one warlord fighting against Nur al-Maliki, who's another warlord.
Yep.
And they both enjoy a lot of Shia support. They both have a large Shia popular support because of religious and sectarian reasons, not because they're good people, but because the ones that are following Muqtada Sadr believe that he's their religious, spiritual leader. And so whatever he says, they do. And then the ones that are following Al-Itar al-Tansiqi is basically the coalition of Shia parties that's running the Iraqi government right now, which is headed by the Prime Minister, Mustafa al-Kadhimi. Okay, so this Itar al-Tansiqi, this group of Shia parties, with Nur al-Maliki at its center, wanted to elect a guy by the name of Sudani. They wanted to put him in government. Just to give you an idea of how bankrupt these parties are in Iraq. You know, the Iraqi elections were called upon in 2021. So in 2021, the Iraqi government decided to run elections. That was a complete failure. There was boycott of the elections. Iraqis didn't turn up. And so to this day, in 2022, 1 year later, they still don't have a government. They haven't elected a government. So the country is basically suffering from a void in government. There is nobody leading the country. Mustafa al-Kadhimi is still there, but he's not supposed to be there. They're supposed to elect someone new. So the Itar al-Tansiqi, this group led by Nur al-Maliki, wanted to put in place a guy by the name of Sudani. Now, Muqtada Sadr didn't like that. He didn't want Sudani in power. Why? Because Muqtada Sadr enjoyed success in those elections. He has a political clout now in government. But Nur al-Maliki does not want to give him power in government. So all of this fiasco, he ordered his followers to march into Baghdad and occupy the parliament in a show of force, just to show that he can actually go into the green zone and he can literally take over the parliament himself with his followers. So they did this. And all these corrupt politicians like mice just disappeared. They left Baghdad. And his followers, their video footage of this, rampaged in the parliament, much like the Trump supporters, wanted to go into Washington, D.C. and take over, the government, literally just walk in and take over the government. And so this criminal, Muqtada Sadr, did the same thing, ordered his followers to do that. And so back to 2022, still no government in Iraq. Muqtada Sadr decides he's going to join the protests. And so all these commemorative events that are taking place right now in the country, there are Muqtada Sadr followers that have joined the October protesters. The new development, and this is just out today, is that the October revolutionary, the activists that were part of the October 2019 movement, they have withdrawn from Baghdad. They pulled out. And now there are only Muqtada Sadr followers in Baghdad.
Can you repeat that? So you said the original protesters from 2019 have pulled out because they don't want to associate with Sadr. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's two reasons. There's an interview that I saw this morning with one of the organizers, and they asked him why they pulled out of Baghdad. And the reason he gave was because they got news that the government is getting ready to basically massacre people in Baghdad. And so to avoid the killing of tens and tens of these activists, they took the decision to leave. But in my own perspective, I think, yes, that is a main reason for them pulling out. But I also think they want to separate themselves out from Muqtada Sadr as well. The reason being is Muqtada Sadr is playing a dirty game by hiding within the October demonstrators, by embedding his followers inside of the protests that are taking place right now. And so I think it's a smart move on the part of the organizers to distance themselves from Muqtada Sadr followers.
So yeah, that's a lot of information right there, and this is pretty complicated stuff, and people aren't going to find it readily available in just the mainstream media. So I think this is very important for people who consider themselves to be anti-imperialist to understand, especially the history of what's been going on in Iraq since the U.S. invasion, because to understand the protests, what's going on right now, you really have to have a clear understanding of the history of what's been going on. And if you sort of have this very sort of cheap, simplistic, quote unquote, supposed anti-imperialist view where it's like, oh, the US versus Iran, and Iran is always good because it's against US imperialism, and they're enemies, they would never work together. If you have that view, you have no understanding of what's going on in Iraq today. And a lot of people have this very simplistic view and don't understand this. And it's really good you mentioned the whole situation with Maliki, because Maliki, he was a complete, as you described, he was a complete Iranian proxy. He betrayed his country. He was on the side of Iran during the Iran-Iraq War, the Dawa Party. And following the logic of these people who consider themselves, that have this sort of overly simplistic anti-imperialist view, they would say like, oh, because he was on the side of Iran, then he's anti-US, so therefore good. But let's remember Maliki, who he was. He was the guy, when that Iraqi patriot got up and threw his shoe at George Bush in that famous scene, Maliki was there trying to protect George Bush. That's a perfect image of Maliki and a perfect image of how Iran and the US work together. And these Iranian proxies like Maliki and these others you mentioned, there are all these Dawa Party and other pro-Iran Iraqis who were like Iranian proxies who went over to the West. They were exiles and everything. What were they doing? They were pro-Iran, pro-Khomeini and everything. But what were they doing in the West? They were lobbying. They were going activism and lobbying to try and get the United States to invade Iraq, to bomb Iraq, to put more sanctions on Iraq. The same sort of thing that you see with a lot of exiles from countries that the U.S. is targeting now, like Venezuela or Syria or other countries. You see a lot of exiles from those countries here, like lobbying for the U.S. to attack their own country. This is what these pro-Iran people like Maliki and others were doing. They were lobbying for the U.S. to attack their country, and that's why when the U.S. invaded, they eventually put Maliki and these other puppets in power. They were useful stooges. So this idea that Iran and the U.S. are always enemies is overly simplistic. And when you look at the history of Iraq, after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and since then, they have been working together very closely. Now, there is competition between the two now, but what people should understand is that the damage is done. The Iraqi people, they have no love for the U.S. or Iran because they work together, they massacred the Iraqi people, and they want no foreign occupier in their country. I think that's the whole point there, I think. And so with Sadr though, so you're mentioning like the whole division within the Shia political forces. There's a lot of confusion around that. Doesn't Sadr claim to be anti-Iran? What's the whole deal with his relations to Iran? Because again, he's Shia, but he's claiming to be anti-Iran. And there's a lot of very strong, you mentioned the protests in southern Iraq and Shia areas, Karbala and other areas that are heavily Shia areas, and generally considered to be like strongholds of like Iranian support. But there are huge protests there of Shias, Iraqi Shias, who were against Iran, staunchly against Iran. A few years ago, they burned down the Iranian embassy.
So attacking the Iranian embassy or consulate or pro-Iran militia headquarters, whether it be in Baghdad or in al-Basra or any of the other cities where Iranian representatives are, is common practice. It's been going on for the last, at least since 2019, at least. I mean, this is ongoing. Every now and then you'll hear, and I've reported on this in the U.S. Committee for Iraq reports that I publish every week. Every now and then you'll see protesters targeting headquarters of pro-Iran militia in al-Basra or in any of the other cities in Iraq. They'll burn it down, and it's just ongoing. It's a message they're sending out. And if you hear the chants, if you listen to the chants that are in the demonstrations, it's always Iran barra barra, Iran get out, Iran get out of Iraq. So the youth in Iraq are well aware of the destructive effect of the Iranian occupation of Iraq. It's interesting, you mentioned a couple of things, Nick, I wanted to comment on. If you want, as an American leftist, and I presume this is who's, these are the groups of people that are going to listen into us in this interview. If you're an American leftist, or you're a Western leftist for that matter, you want to understand the American-Iranian relationship. It dates back to the Contra affair, okay? It dates back to Ronald Reagan. This isn't something new. If Iran was truly anti-imperialist, why didn't the imperialists attack Tehran instead of Baghdad? Why did the imperialists, up to this point, since Carter and the hostages crisis, why have there never been a military invasion of Iran? Why has there never been any attempts, the Bay of Pigs in Cuba type coups, or in Venezuela where they wanted to assassinate Maduro or Chavez before? Why haven't we ever heard of American imperialist covert operations in Iran? Because Iran serves U.S. imperialism. America uses the Iranian regime to achieve its goals, and nowhere more clear is that than Iraq. Go back to the Baker-Hamilton document that I mentioned and look at the history of Paul Bremer, the governor of Iraq under U.S. occupation. Paul Bremer is the one that brought all these pro-Iran corrupt politicians of the Dawa party into the Iraqi government. He's the one that promoted Sistani, the religious spiritual leader of the Shia. Who has put all these Iranians in power and pro-Iranian Iraqis in power but the Americans? America enjoys a double-faced relationship with Iran just as much as Iran has a double-faced relationship with America. Khomeini was happy to take Israeli arms, American arms, through Oliver North in exchange for, with the Contra affair during the Ronald Reagan era. He was happy to take American weapons to kill Iraqis and to attack the Iraqi army. In fact, if you look into history, and this is a point we always make, you think, you hear all kinds of nonsense on the American and Western propaganda media outlets. If Iraq and Saddam Hussein was backed by the Americans and Rumsfeld, they always talk about Rumsfeld meeting Saddam Hussein. Why are all the weapons of the Iraqis Soviet or Chinese or Czech? And why are all the weapons of the Iranians American and Israeli? Who was arming who in the Iran-Iraq conflict? And that's not me talking, that's history. You go back and you look at footage of combat that was taking place on battlegrounds between Iraq and Iran from 1980 to 1988. It's American weapons in the Iranian army that the Iranian army had, and it's Soviet and Eastern European armies and Chinese arms, that were held by the Iraqi soldiers. So it's clear who was arming who. Ever since then, the Americans have always played a double-faced relationship. The only difference between the Republicans and Democrats with regards to the Iranian regime is that the Republicans take on a hard line with the Iranian regime because Israel wants that. Israel feels threatened by the Iranian regime, although we don't think the Iranian regime is sincere in actually threatening Israel, because if it were, then it would have attacked Israel. There are no Iranian attacks on Israel. There are Hezbollah attacks on Israel, but they themselves never get involved in any confrontation with Israel. In fact, they were armed by Israeli arms during their war with Iraq.
Oh yeah, Israel was Iran's most important backer, and even Israeli sources and American sources, which would be very embarrassed to admit that even Israeli sources and American sources acknowledge that. But sorry, yeah, continue.
Yeah, so this confusion, I suffer from this when talking to American leftists or Western leftists myself. And I say, yes, Iran says America is the great devil, and America says Iran is an evil. But in fact, under the table, they negotiate with each other and they come to agreements and they fulfill one another's interests. And one of those common interests they have is to put down the Arab nationalist program. That's why they targeted Iraq. That's why they killed President Saddam Hussein. That's why they murdered Gaddafi in Libya and attacked Libya. They are in cahoots with one another because their interests meet one another. They profess through their propaganda that they don't like each other. And I think this is what throws off a lot of Western leftists, is they hear the propaganda, death to Israel, and Israel is the small Satan and America is the great Satan. They'll hear that in Iran, but in practice, and if you look at from a political and military point of view, they have always colluded with one another. And that's because their interests intersect, because their interest is not in truly fighting imperialism. See, Khomeini did not launch his revolution in 1979 to fight imperialism. He launched his revolution in 1979 so he could build the Shia empire that's based on sectarianism. Yeah, so Khomeini did not launch his revolution in 1979 to fight imperialism. He launched his revolution to build the Shia empire where he becomes the ruler of the Shia Muslim world. And that's still the intention of what's going on here in Iraq. Iraq, their allegiance, Noor al-Maliki, Haydar al-Abbadi, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, I can name another 3, 4, all of those are their allegiance to the Wali al-Faqih. Right now, Ali Khamenei, the religious spiritual leader in Iran, is also the religious spiritual leader of all these agents in Iraq. And so they follow what he says. Now, Muqtada al-Sadr is an interesting case. Muqtada al-Sadr, I would describe him as a warlord, okay, as a religious spiritual leader who enjoys his own army. The guy has his own army in Iraq. It's called Jaysh al-Mahdi, the al-Mahdi army. And he attacked American US troops. His al-Mahdi fighters attacked American troops. So he has no allegiance to anyone. He has an allegiance to himself. What does Muqtada al-Sadr want in Iraq? He wants to be the ruler of Iraq. He wants political power in Iraq. And he believes he is the religious leader of all his followers and probably of all of the Shias in Iraq. And he's trying to assume a position of power to represent those that follow him. He has no interest. And by the way, these people are extremely incompetent in running a state. Okay, they are not meant to. He's not going to fix electricity problems for the Iraqi people. He's not going to fix water problems, employment problems, none of that. Okay, these just solely, they are reactionary leaders. They are ill-qualified to run a country. They can't even run a city. If you give, Medinat al-Sadr is a poor suburb of Baghdad, that's littered with garbage and sewage and so on, and a big Shia stronghold. It's named after the Sadr, the family of Muqtada al-Sadr. They can't even fix the sewage problem in Sadr city, yet alone run a country as important as central as Iraq is. Again, American imperialism uses the Iranian regime to meet its ends in Iraq and all over the Arab region. And I'll give you an example of one of the things they do. You see, Foreign Policy is an elite political magazine in the United States. Okay, I used to read Foreign Policy 20 years ago. And it's obviously CIA related. Like everything that goes in foreign policy almost mimics what American imperialism plans on doing in the world. And it's, as its name implies, it looks at foreign countries and US interests in those countries. Foreign Policy ran a story, and I published this in last week's US committee report. I think it was last week. And in it, they say, we predict, this is the American imperialists speaking through one of their elite political organs. And it's an intellectual magazine. It's not something, anybody can read. They say, we predict there's going to be a Shia civil war. In fact, I think they're working towards a Shia civil war. Because the weaker Iraq is, the less likely it's going to get a patriotic government that's run by the people and representative of people interests. So in a way, the Americans benefit from a Shia civil war taking place. They've always had that policy. They pit one, they go to the indigenous people and they find out what kind of religious conflicts they have, what kind of racial and ethnic tensions they have, and they grow it out. They make it bigger and bigger because it weakens the state. It weakens a true national alternative. And so it is, at the end of the day, in the benefit of the American imperialists that Iraq should remain weak, with inner fighting. One time it's ethnic fight, it's the Kurds against the Arabs, or it's the Shia against the Sunnis, or it's, if it's in Lebanon, it's the Maronites against the Muslims, they love that kind of conflict. Where did they get this from? They got this from the British imperialists. The British imperialists are notorious for that as one of their pillars of foreign policy and colonial rule. Just look at China. They did atrocities in China with the Opium Wars and so on. And anybody that reads the history of British occupation and colonial expansion understands exactly how the British operated. The Americans are doing exactly the same thing in Iraq today. One thing I want to mention that I didn't mention in the first part I should give you some casualty figures. On October 1st, on that Saturday, the number of injuries of protesters were reported by the Jordan Times. Jordan Times is an English-speaking magazine. You can find it on the internet. I just went and did a quick search so I can give you an idea of what happened on that day. On that day, 36 protesters were injured, mostly because of breathing problems, because they shot tear gas canisters at them. And what the initial preparation ahead of the demonstrations, the government had put concrete slabs to block off the bridges and the pathways that lead into the green zone, where the government headquarters are of the Iraqi government. And so one of the first things the protesters managed to do is throw those concrete blocks into the river and make their way into the green zone, because that was their objective. Their immediate objective was to march into the green zone and demand that this government be brought down and that a patriotic government be elected in its place that can actually run the country. And one of their other demands was the end of pro-Iran militia rule in the streets. Because right now in Iraq, it's chaos, right? These pro-Iran militia, they're the ones that have the power. They're the ones carrying the guns. And so you've got the security forces, which are the official Iraqi army personnel on one hand. And then you've got these pro-Iran militia, a dozen pro-Iran militia that are running rampage throughout the whole country from the north all the way to the south, with the exception of the Kurds, because the Kurds have their own reactionary militias as well. And so And so the situation is completely out of control. And so one of the things the Iraqis want is an end to the rule of these militias that are destroying the country. See, if you read that article, if you go back to foreign policy, you read that article, you understand what the think tanks in American foreign policy, the decision makers, what's going on in their mind. And what they're saying in that report is they're trying to portray Muqtada Sadr as anti-Iranian. Okay, I don't think he's anti-Iranian. I don't think Muqtada Sadr is necessarily anti-Iranian. I think he's a rug warlord. I think he's someone who is trying to establish a sphere of power for himself. He works alongside the Iranians when things work out for him, and he'll work against them perhaps, or go against some of their plans.
So he's a complete opportunist, basically. As of right now, it's convenient for him.
In my estimation, and I don't know the man obviously, but in my estimation, I think he's completely opportunistic. The Americans are the ones that are trying to portray him as anti-Iranian. But if you speak to, and I asked about this, if you talk to Iraqi leaders, when I say leaders, I'm talking about, for example, ex-diplomats that were part of the Saddam government, right, that served in Iraq, and you ask them about Muqtada Sadr, their answer is going to be what I heard them. I read one particular account of this. They will tell you that all of this inner fighting, all of this Shia inner fighting between Sadr and Maliki, at the end of the day, serves Iranian interests. In fact, Sadr is playing into Iranian plans to foment dissension amongst the Shias and to derail this path of the protesters, which is basically the demand to get Iran out of Iraq and to elect a patriotic Iraqi government that is run by skilled and qualified professionals that can solve the problems of the country. And so you'll literally read their articles talking about Sadr in such a way that he plays into Iranian interests. He's not against Iranian interests. He actually serves, at the end of the day, Iranian interests in Iraq.
Another topic that's been in the news, that's been actually getting a lot more coverage than the protests in Iraq, is the protest nearby in Iran. Now, it should be viewed as related because, of course, the situation in Iraq, a big aspect of that, maybe the primary aspect right now, is trying to liberate Iraq from the Iranian occupation and everything. So what is your view on the protests in Iran right now?
Yeah, it's not just my view, but it's the view of Iraqi patriots as well. If you go to albasra.net, which is a great media outlet, unfortunately it's in Arabic, and and I should give them credit because I translate the Iraqi Weekly Report off of their website. You'll understand that they are in full support. I'm talking about the Baathists, the patriotic Iraqis. On the website, they carry news about the Iranian revolt against the Iranian regime every single day. And they follow very closely what's going on in Iran. If the Iranian regime collapses and a true representative of the Iranian people takes place, that is not, and I can't emphasize this more, that is not allied to Israel and the imperialists, then the situation in Iraq will become a lot easier for the Iraqis to liberate themselves. If you bring down the Iranian regime, then the agents of Iran will collapse in Iraq. In fact, I remember speaking to an Iraqi one time, activist, and he told me, we can take over the country in 24 hours. If Iran is out of Iraq, the Baathists can regain the country in 24 hours from north to the south. I mean, that's how important the bringing down of the Iranian regime is for straightening out things in Iraq. But myself, Iraqi patriots, Baathists. We are all in support of bringing down the Iranian regime by the Iranian people, no one else. I mean, right now, as we speak, in Iran, and I published this in the report, I think this last week or the week before, 146 cities are running anti-government demonstrations in Iran. 200 have been killed, 10,000 arrested in the first 10 days of the protest. And as you know, Nick, these protests came because the religious police there killed a Kurdish lady, 22-year-old, for not putting on her hijab. So we're talking about a regime that is reactionary, that is against its own people. The Iranian people deserve a better government that they can decide on themselves. I, as an anti-imperialist, would urge them to not, bring back the Shah or some reactionary monarchy rule back into their country, because it's like taking a step backward. You replace the religious clergy with the monarchy again. Great. That's not a progressive or leftist solution or anti-imperialist solution that can fix the problems of the country. But that's for the Iranian people to decide upon. As you know, the Ba'athist Iraq was always in support of Mujahideen Khalq. Mujahideen Khalq, the military opposition group run by today Maryam Rajawi, but at that time had bases in Iraq from which they launched military attacks against Khomeini and the Iranian regime inside of Iran. So Iraq was hosting these guerrilla fighters and paid a heavy price for that and continued to support them. And when you go on the Ba'athist website, the one I mentioned to you, albasra.net, you will see daily support of ongoing protests by the Iranian people to bring down the Iranian regime.
It's an internal issue for them to decide for themselves, and that no foreign country should be involved in it. The MEK at that time period was revolutionary. Now, I think you probably would agree they're not such a good force today.
No, they're not. They're not. And those Persian nationalists are part of the problem. If you go into their ranks, you'll see either they're pro-Israel or they're pro-imperialist, or they want to bring back the Shah.
As far as the protests going on currently in Iraq right now, what is the way forward for this situation? How do you see this resolving? What are the prospects for the liberation of the country? How do you see this going forward?
It's interesting to look at this from different angles. So on one hand, the international situation plays a big part in what's going on in Iraq, as it governs most parts of the world. And so the sooner the Iranian regime falls, the sooner these protests will be successful in Iraq. And I think that's part of the reason why the Iraqi resistance is so keen on seeing developments in Iran take a positive turn with the overthrow of the current Iranian government. So I think regionally speaking, it's very much, if the Iranian regime falls, as I mentioned before, things become a lot easier for the Iraqis to gain their independence. That's on one hand. On the other hand, what's the situation with U.S. imperialism? Can you predict when is U.S. imperialism going to be weakened in Iraq? No, I don't know what the answer is. Right now, on an international level, we can see this unipolar system move to a multipolar system. What I mean by that is we're looking at something similar to what used to be the Soviet bloc on one hand and the US imperialist bloc on the other hand. But today, there is no Soviet bloc, unfortunately, for us as independence movements in Arabia. Instead, what we have is this Russian-Chinese alliance on one hand, and then on the other hand, the American imperialists. And as you know, the Russian-Chinese alliance isn't exactly communist. Russia is nationalist, and China, as you know, since Deng Xiaoping, has become socialist capitalist, or as Deng Xiaoping would say, socialism, or let's say capitalism with socialist characteristics. And so it's not, the more US imperialism is weakened, the more its role in Iraq will be limited, and the more the chances of the patriotic forces of Iraq, whether they be the protesters, the peaceful demonstrations that we're seeing in the southern provinces and in Baghdad, or the Ba'athist and patriotic front that's been calling for a democratically elected government in Iraq. So Iranian regime gets weakened, US imperialism gets weakened, better prospects for the Iraqi revolution to succeed. 2022 protests, of course, are going to be ongoing throughout the year. This isn't something that happens one day and stops. And I think I tried to give you an update on what happened on October 1st. So on October 1st, there were two things that I followed. One, breaching the concrete blocks that the protesters managed to do, making their way into the green zone. And then secondly, the decision to pull out of Baghdad, which I heard today in an interview this morning, because of the government's attempt to massacre protesters in Baghdad. But if you listen in to what the leader of one of the organizers was saying this morning, he said, this is ongoing. This isn't going to stop. We just thought we would divert our protests so that we wouldn't give an opportunity for the government to massacre the youth that are right now sitting in Baghdad, sitting ducks, basically. Because what you're dealing with here, Nick, you're dealing with a government that knows nothing of human rights, okay? I mean, these are guys that will not hesitate to open live ammunition fire on the protesters. They will use live bullets to kill protesters. And in fact, there's documented evidence of this, that since 2019, government snipers would take aim at protesters' heads. When you take an aim at someone's head, that's a kill. That's an instant kill. These protesters are not armed. They have no way of defending themselves. They are completely vulnerable to anyone who opens fire on them. You will sustain serious casualties if you stay where you're at. And so they made the decision. Of course, me and you are sitting comfortably far away from all this. We have nothing to fear or worry about, but these are people that are putting their lives on the line. And so it's their decision and what they see appropriate. And so it's going to be interesting to see what are the subsequent steps that they're going to take. Because as you know, I publish a weekly report. And so for the next weeks, we'll see what kind of developments are happening, what kind of maneuvers they decide on, what kind of actions, because he did promise that there are going to be follow-up steps, that they are not stopping, that they're going to be continuing their protest, maybe by different means or different locations, I'm not sure. But it'll be something that I'll definitely be reporting on as part of my weekly report on the U.S. Committee for Iraq Group. And I invite anyone who's listening in to become a member of the U.S. Committee for Iraq if you're interested in Iraq. And I think it's a central anti-imperialist struggle for all anti-imperialists in the world. It's very, very important. If you don't believe me, ask Washington. The Americans are there for a reason. If Iraq was not important for imperialism, they wouldn't be there. And they wouldn't continue to be there for as long as they've been there. We're talking about 2003, we're coming upon 2023. So 20 years. They've been in Iraq for the last 20 years. That's the lifetime of some of these young protesters that are 19 and 20 years old. So they were born when the Americans first came to Baghdad, and they're still there in Baghdad, Iraq. So Iraq is extremely important. If you are interested, there is a weekly report that I publish. Please go and become a member of the committee. Spread the report to your contacts. Let's get the word out on this critical anti-imperialist struggle that's taking place in Iraq. And as I always say, you mentioned, if you look at the background that we chose for today's session, if you're fighting for Iraq, you're fighting for Palestine. The minute Iraq wins, the road for liberating Palestine becomes important, becomes very viable. And so, as a Palestinian, as someone seeing my own ancestral land struggle under Israeli occupation, that's why I've always been interested in Iraq, because I know that as I fight for Iraq's freedom, I'm also fighting for Palestine's freedom.
Absolutely. Very well said. And again, please check out our guest, Falastini Mukhtarab's book. He wrote a book called U.S. Foreign Policy in Iraq and the Iraqi Resistance. This book provides a very good in-depth coverage of all of this history we're talking about in Iraq 2003 to now. And this is information that you're not going to see in the mainstream media. This is information that isn't well known with anti-imperialists in the West, but in the Arab world and Iraq, this is very well known. The people know about all of this. And that's why there's largely, when we talk about these things, there's kind of a disconnect between Western anti-imperialists and what Western anti-imperialists think of the situation and what Iraqis think, what a lot of Arabs in general think about the whole situation with Iran. So please check out U.S. Foreign Policy in Iraq and the Iraqi Resistance. The link will be included in the description. And check out the weekly report that our guest puts out. And I just want to say that never count out the Iraqi people. Since 2003, Iraq has been in chaos and destruction, but the Iraqi people have continuously fought for the liberation of their country, and they're continuing to fight for the liberation of their country, and they will succeed eventually. And when they do, it will become a powerhouse again, as it was during the socialist Ba'athist period. And that's what the imperialists are most afraid of. That's what the various reactionary forces are most afraid of. And as our guest mentioned, these protests are ongoing. So please pay attention to what's going on in Iraq, because these are ongoing. This is going to be developing. Keep an eye on the situation in Iraq and follow this channel, and as well as Falastini Mukhtarab's work to see what's going on in Iraq. And so I want to thank you for coming on. This has been a great discussion. I think people have learned a lot that they otherwise wouldn't have heard from an Arab perspective, someone who's been following the situation in Iraq for a very long time, very closely. So thank you so much for that. And thank you all for watching. Please like the video, subscribe, leave a comment. It helps fight against the YouTube censorship. So help share this out to get this message out to fight against the YouTube censorship. Thank you all so much, and see you next time.
My pleasure, Nick. Take care. Keep the good work going.